So what we're going to do today, I'm going to talk about first, I'll tell you what the 5 essential brushstrokes that I find are important. Then I'm going to say, why do I include those brushstrokes? Then we're going to go into each one and talk about them. And I'm going to show you a lot of charts that are going to illustrate these brushstrokes in action. But before I even go there, let me just say, I look at the horoscope from a life purpose perspective. When I look at the natal chart in consultation, I'm trying to say, what is this soul working on polishing, healing, developing in this lifetime? And of course, I'm going to look for 1 or 2 dominating horoscope structures that stand out to help me illustrate that. And usually those dominating horoscope structures are going to be conjunctions, squares, oppositions, something with developmental tension, because the soul will naturally try to resolve that in their growth process. But I also add these little nuances, these 5 essential brush strokes, and it helps to flush the entire theme out. Okay, so let me show you what these 5 essential brush strokes are. The key brush strokes that I always add, number 1 is going to be the unaspected planet. Now again, in a moment, I'm going to go through these in more detail, but I can tell you the unaspected planet, just depending on how many aspects show up in your aspect grid and what orbs you use, since we all have computers and more people are including so many aspects, you may never have an unaspected planet show up. I do because of the orbs I use and the aspects that show up on my grid. But it's also talking about when a planet receives no Ptolemaic aspects from planet to planet. So we'll get there and I'll illustrate that for you. I'm looking for the Aries point, planets or angles. And what I mean by the Aries point are planets or angles at 0 cardinal, any one of the 4 cardinal signs. So that would be Aries, Cancer, Libra, Capricorn. When we find a planet or angle at 0 cardinal, it's called the Aries point. It's a nuance that is very important. I'm looking at the Oriental planet, which is the planet that rises before the sun. I'll show you examples. I'm looking at the Sun-Moon midpoint, essential. As a matter of fact, I'm going to be speaking about the Sun-Moon midpoint when I speak for the ISAR conference in August 2021. And what I'm looking at is, are there planets or angles equaling that Sun-Moon midpoint? And then, of course, most people understand the power of angular planets. Planets conjunct any one of the 4 angles. And so I'll show you examples of that. So now let's go into, why do I include these particular brush strokes? And so what I say is that natal planets receiving a key brushstroke make a strong statement, and they become very important in one's development and life purpose. It adds emphasis to the planet. If you have a planet that receives one of the 5 brushstrokes I talk about, it brings emphasis. It adds prominence and power to the strength of that planet. And the most important thing here, in my point of view, is it increases the need expression of the planet. Now, I work a lot with need theory. And when we think of what does Venus need? Well, Venus needs harmony. Venus needs to accommodate. Venus needs peace and so forth. So if you have Venus receiving brushstrokes, that frequency, that Venus energy is going to be very, very strong in the person's life development and life purpose. So planets with brushstroke emphasis have a heightened influence in the personality and gain a stronger and more prominent influence in the horoscope. It really is that simple. And the psychodynamic need of the planet becomes a focal point in one's life development, and the affairs of the house or houses that the planet rules gains importance. This is so important right here, this basic statement. The psychodynamic need of the planet becomes a focal point in one's life development when it receives brushstrokes. So I call this advanced simplicity in astrology. So let me explain this. I've been doing this a long time. I started studying astrology when I was 8 years old, and I studied privately. I learned through books. I didn't really get connected to an astrological community until I connected with my friend Noelle Till and the community there. So I studied for a long, long time by myself. And we know that when we start our study in astrology, we start simply, right? The building blocks of astrology, we start with planets, signs, houses, and we start with that simplicity, modalities, elements, and so forth. And then the more we get involved, the more complex we make it, especially when computers are involved. The reason I talked about the fact that I started so young is when I learned astrology, I want to say computers weren't invented, haha, but we didn't have the astrological software. So I had to calculate everything by hand for years and years and years. I started my practice when I was 24 years old. That was 1983. And Matrix software, I can't remember what year it came out, but it was just about that time. So I was doing it by hand. And when you do charts by hand, you appreciate simplicity because you have to calculate everything yourself. As soon as through the stroke of a key, millions of different or thousands of different measurements suddenly appear, simplicity somewhat goes out the window. But what ends up happening, and I teach a lot of students, I do a lot one-on-one and I do a lot through coursework, and I get students who are overwhelmed by measurements, overwhelmed and can't synthesize and can't see the whole picture because they keep piling on more and more and more and more. And that seems to be an epidemic right now in astrology. And after you do that long enough, after you pile on so many measurements, after a while, especially if you're talking to clients, you start chopping away at what you don't need. And I say I take out my astrological machete and I start slicing away at measurements that no longer really serve what I need in a consultation. And it brings me back to advanced simplicity in astrology, brings me back to the planets. I was actually quite pleased with that phrase, advanced simplicity. It would be more like simplified complexity, but I prefer advanced simplicity. And it brings me back to the planets themselves, which are the basic intrinsic energies, the building blocks of the entire system, right? And what it does when we apply these brush strokes is it helps us to recognize the loudest planetary frequency. And I do think of the planets in terms of frequencies. You know, if you think about when you meet somebody and they are, let's say they are keyed to the frequency of Saturn, that's going to feel very, very different than if you meet somebody who has a very, very strong Venusian energy. And you will know the difference instantly. Just like you will know if somebody is keyed to the frequency of Uranus and you compare that to the frequency of Pluto, you're going to feel the difference. So I do think in terms of planets as frequencies, and applying these brushstrokes helps us to recognize the loudest planetary frequency. And then we appreciate the need emphasis as part of the life purpose. And we say to ourselves, why is that person keyed to the frequency of Mercury? Why is Mercury so strong in their energy field? How does that help them as a soul? Why is that perspective there? What are they polishing? That's how I think about it. So for me personally, I never overlook the power of simplicity, but it took a while to get there.